The morning of August 9, 1942. Solomon Islands, Pacific Ocean. Captain Howard Bode stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Chicago, scanning the black waters through his binoculars. The sea was calm, almost mirror-like under the tropical stars. No radar contacts, no visual sightings, no warning of any kind. In less than 30 minutes, invisible death would streak through those peaceful waters at 49 knots, carrying a warhead powerful enough to crack a battleship in half. The weapon that was about to shatter American naval confidence had been traveling toward them for nearly 20 minutes, launched from a distance so great that no Allied commander would have believed it possible. 11 miles away, Japanese destroyers had already turned for home, their deadly cargo dispatched into the darkness with surgical precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans had no idea what was coming. They had no concept that such a weapon even existed. In their intelligence files, Japanese torpedoes were classified as inferior copies of Western designs, short-ranged and unreliable. The reality racing toward USS Chicago through the Solomon Sea would prove that assessment catastrophically wrong. This was the Type 93 torpedo, known to its creators as the WWII, the oxygen torpedo. To Allied sailors who survived its devastation, it would become known by a different name, the Long Lance. 24 inches in diameter, 29 feet long, carrying an 1,100-pound warhead of high explosive, capable of maintaining maximum speed for over 22 miles without leaving a single bubble trail to warn its victims. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The torpedo that was about to rewrite naval warfare had been conceived not in desperation, but in careful calculation. While American and British naval strategists focused on aircraft carriers and radar technology, Japanese engineers had pursued a different path to naval supremacy. They understood that in the vast Pacific, where fleets might engage at ranges of 10 or 15 miles, the side that could strike first with undetectable weapons would control the outcome. The Long Lance represented the culmination of 15 years of secretive development, a weapon so advanced that Allied intelligence agencies refused to believe early reports of its capabilities. To understand the weapon that was about to devastate the Allied fleet at Savo Island, one must first understand the philosophy behind its creation. Japanese naval doctrine in the 1930s centered on the decisive battle concept, the idea that a single massive engagement would determine control of the Pacific, but Japanese admirals knew they would be outnumbered in any such battle. American industrial capacity could build more ships faster than Japan could ever hope to match. The solution lay not in matching American numbers, but in developing weapons so superior that Japanese forces could inflict disproportionate damage before their enemies could respond effectively. The Long Lance torpedo embodied this philosophy perfectly. Its development began in 1928 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, where a team of engineers led by Rear Admiral Toshihide Asakura embarked on the most ambitious torpedo project ever attempted. Their goal was not merely to improve existing designs, but to create an entirely new class of weapon that would give Japanese destroyers and cruisers the ability to engage enemy fleets at ranges previously considered impossible. The technical challenges were staggering. Conventional torpedoes of the era used compressed air to power their engines, limiting their range to perhaps 6 or 7 miles at maximum speed. The exhaust from these air-driven engines created visible bubble trails that warned enemy ships of incoming attacks. Japanese engineers decided to solve both problems with a revolutionary approach: pure oxygen propulsion. Oxygen burns much hotter than air, providing more power per unit of fuel consumed. More importantly, oxygen combustion produces no nitrogen exhaust, eliminating the telltale bubble trail that gave away torpedo positions. But working with pure oxygen presented deadly risks. Oxygen under pressure becomes violently explosive when it contacts organic materials like rubber gaskets or oil residue. Early test torpedoes literally blew up on their launching racks, killing technicians and destroying equipment. The Imperial Navy lost dozens of men during the development process, men whose deaths were classified as training accidents to maintain secrecy around the project. Each explosion taught engineers more about oxygen handling, gradually leading to safer procedures and better materials. By 1933, they had solved the basic safety problems and begun focusing on performance optimization. The resulting weapon was a masterpiece of engineering that pushed 1930s technology to its absolute limits. The Type 93 torpedo measured exactly 24 inches in diameter and 29 feet 4 inches in length, weighing 3,000 pounds when fully loaded. Its warhead contained 1,110 pounds of Type 97 explosive, a mixture more powerful than standard TNT. The oxygen propulsion system could drive the torpedo at 49 knots for over 22 miles, or at 36 knots for an incredible 40 miles. No torpedo in any other navy could match even half that performance. More importantly, the Long Lance left no visible wake during its run. Enemy lookouts scanning the water for incoming attacks would see nothing until the moment of impact. Ships had no warning, no opportunity to take evasive action, no chance to prepare for the devastating explosion that would follow. This invisibility factor multiplied the weapon's tactical value far beyond its impressive range and speed specifications. Japanese torpedo specialists understood that their creation represented more than just improved weaponry. It was a force multiplier that could allow smaller Japanese fleets to engage larger Allied formations with devastating effect. A single destroyer armed with 8 Long Lance torpedoes could potentially cripple or sink multiple enemy cruisers from a distance greater than most naval gun ranges. The psychological impact would be equally important. Enemy commanders, never knowing when invisible death might be racing toward them through the water, would become cautious, hesitant, less aggressive in their tactical decisions. The weapon's development had proceeded under such tight security that even most Imperial Navy officers remained unaware of its capabilities. Production began at the Kure Naval Arsenal in 1935, with initial deliveries to selected destroyer and cruiser squadrons for training and evaluation. Torpedo crews underwent months of specialized instruction in oxygen handling procedures, learning to service and maintain weapons that could explode without warning if mishandled. The training was necessarily limited to prevent security breaches, with many crew members understanding only their specific portion of the weapon's operation. By 1941, when Japan launched its Pacific offensive, over 4,000 Long Lance torpedoes had been manufactured and distributed to frontline units. Japanese destroyers carried 8 torpedoes, each in quadruple launcher mounts, while heavy cruisers mounted 12 to 24 torpedoes depending on their configuration. Light cruisers typically carried 8 to 12. This gave Japanese surface forces an enormous advantage in night actions, where their superior optical equipment and intensive training could combine with Long Lance range and invisibility to devastating effect. American naval intelligence had detected hints of improved Japanese torpedo performance during the early months of the Pacific War, but analysts consistently underestimated the magnitude of advancement. Reports from survivors described torpedo attacks from impossible ranges, but these accounts were dismissed as confusion under combat stress. When USS Destroyer Porter was sunk in October 1942 by a torpedo that appeared to come from nowhere, investigators concluded that an undetected Japanese submarine must have been responsible. The idea that a surface ship could launch torpedoes from beyond visual range seemed too fantastic to consider seriously. This intelligence failure would prove costly beyond measure. Allied fleet commanders, unaware that they faced a weapon capable of reaching them from distances of 10 or 15 miles, positioned their ships according to conventional torpedo threat assessments. They maintained formations suitable for defending against attacks from 3 or 4 miles, not realizing that death could be approaching from over the horizon. The stage was set for a series of naval engagements that would shatter Allied confidence and force a complete re-evaluation of Pacific naval strategy. The Long Lance torpedo had given Japanese forces a secret weapon of such superiority that it would dominate night surface actions for over 2 years. American sailors would pay for their intelligence agencies' failures with their lives, while Japanese destroyers and cruisers used their invisible advantage to sink ship after ship in a string of victories that seemed almost supernatural to their victims. The first major test of this revolutionary weapon was approaching fast. On the night of August 9, 1942, Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was leading 7 Japanese cruisers and 1 destroyer toward the Solomon Islands, where an Allied invasion fleet lay, anchored off Guadalcanal. Intelligence had informed Mikawa that over 80 Allied ships, including numerous cruisers and destroyers, were concentrated in the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. It was exactly the type of target the Long Lance had been designed to destroy. Mikawa's ships had been detected by Allied reconnaissance aircraft earlier that day, but radio transmission delays meant that many Allied commanders remained unaware of the approaching threat. Those who had received the warnings assumed they would face a conventional torpedo attack from close range, requiring Japanese ships to penetrate to within 2 or 3 miles of their targets. Allied cruisers and destroyers took positions designed to intercept such an attack, confident in their radar advantage and superior numbers. They had no idea that Japanese torpedoes were already in the water, launched from a distance so great that the attacking ships were invisible beyond the horizon. The Long Lance weapons were racing through the darkness at 49 knots, their pure oxygen engines burning silently, with no telltale bubbles to mark their passage. In the Allied formation, radar operators saw nothing unusual. Lookouts scanning the black water detected no approaching wakes. Radio operators heard only routine communications between friendly ships. Captain Bode on USS Chicago represented the tragic irony of that night. He commanded one of the most modern heavy cruisers in the Pacific Fleet, equipped with the latest radar systems and fire control technology. His ship mounted 9 8-inch guns, capable of devastating any Japanese cruiser at ranges up to 15 miles. His crew had trained extensively for night surface actions, practicing gunnery and damage control until their responses became automatic. They were prepared for any conventional naval battle, but they were not prepared for a weapon that could kill them from beyond the range of their own guns, without warning, without detection, without any opportunity to fight back. The Long Lance torpedo, racing toward USS Chicago through the Solomon Sea, represented more than just advanced engineering. It embodied a fundamentally different approach to naval warfare, one that prioritized stealth and standoff capability over brute firepower and armor protection. The contrast between American and Japanese naval philosophy was about to be written in fire and steel across the waters of what would become known as Iron Bottom Sound. American ships, designed for daylight battles where superior radar and gunfire could dominate, found themselves fighting at night against an enemy whose weapons were invisible until the moment they struck. Japanese commanders, trained for close-range torpedo attacks that required skill and courage, discovered they could destroy enemy fleets from distances that made retaliation impossible. As the Long Lance torpedo continued its deadly approach toward the unsuspecting Allied fleet, it carried with it the power to change naval history. The weapon that Japanese engineers had spent 15 years perfecting was about to announce its existence in the most dramatic way possible, by sinking Allied cruisers that never knew what hit them. At exactly 01:43 hours on August 9, 1942, the first Long Lance torpedo found its target, USS Canberra, an Australian heavy cruiser steaming in formation with the Allied screening force, simply exploded. No warning, no incoming wake visible to lookouts, no radar contact to alert the crew. One moment the ship was cutting through calm seas at 15 knots, her crew standing normal watch routines. The next moment, 1,100 pounds of high explosive detonated against her starboard side, ripping a hole 40 feet wide and flooding 3 engine rooms instantly. The explosion was so massive that sailors on other ships 3 miles away felt the concussion through their hulls. Canberra's forward superstructure crumpled, like paper, as the blast wave travelled through her internal spaces. Emergency lighting failed throughout the ship. Steam pipes ruptured, filling compartments with scalding vapour that killed men before they could escape. Within minutes, the cruiser was listing heavily to starboard, her engines dead, her main guns unable to bear on targets that remained invisible in the darkness. Captain Frank Getting, commanding Canberra, had no idea what had hit his ship. Radio reports flooding in from other vessels suggested torpedo attacks, but the ranges seemed impossible. Japanese ships had been sighted earlier at distances of 20 to 30 miles. No torpedo in existence could cover such distances while maintaining the speed necessary for effective attack. Yet Canberra was dying from what could only be torpedo damage, her hull plates twisted and torn in patterns that matched no other weapon type. The confusion spread throughout the Allied formation as more long-lance torpedoes found their marks. USS Chicago, flagship of the Southern Screening Force, took a torpedo hit that blew away 60 feet of her bow. The explosion occurred so far forward that many crew members initially thought they had struck a mine. Captain Bode, standing on the bridge when the weapon detonated, was thrown against the bulkhead by the concussion. When he regained his footing and looked forward, he could see stars through the gaping hole where his ship's bow had been moments before. But the long-lance attack was just beginning. Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force had launched 43 torpedoes in the opening phase of what would become known as the Battle of Savo Island. The weapons had been fired from positions 8 to 11 miles from their targets, distances that placed the Japanese ships beyond effective radar detection in the clutter of surrounding islands. Allied commanders found themselves under devastating attack from an enemy they could not see, using weapons they did not know existed. The tactical situation collapsed with terrifying speed. Heavy cruiser USS Vincennes, steaming in the Northern Screening Force, took 2 long-lance hits in rapid succession. The first torpedo struck amidships, destroying her No. 2 turret and killing 37 men instantly. The second hit aft, flooding the steering compartment and jamming her rudder hard to port. Captain Frederick Reefcole ordered emergency damage control, but his ship was already mortally wounded. Vincennes began a slow circle to port, her guns firing blindly into the darkness at targets that might or might not exist. USS Astoria suffered an even worse fate. 3 long-lance torpedoes bracketed the heavy cruiser within 90 seconds, each detonation tearing massive holes in her hull. The first hit forward, destroying her No. 1 turret and igniting ammunition stored in the handling rooms below. The resulting explosion blew out her forward superstructure and killed most of the men in the Combat Information Center. The second torpedo struck amidships, flooding her engine rooms and causing massive steam explosions that scalded dozens of sailors to death. The third hit aft, destroying her steering gear and rendering her uncontrollable. Captain William Greenman, commanding Astoria, found himself in command of a burning wreck that was settling by the bow and listing to starboard. Emergency parties struggled to contain fires that were rapidly spreading throughout the ship, but damage control equipment had been destroyed by the torpedo explosions. Radio communications were sporadic due to antenna damage. Most importantly, Greenman still had no clear picture of what was attacking his ship or where the enemy might be located. The invisibility of the long-lance torpedoes created a psychological impact that was almost as devastating as their physical destruction. Allied sailors, trained to watch for the white wakes of conventional torpedoes, could not defend against weapons that left no trace of their approach. Lookouts scanning the water through binoculars saw only empty ocean until the moment of impact. Radar operators detected nothing unusual on their screens. The torpedoes appeared to materialize from nowhere, striking without warning and disappearing back into the darkness. Captain Samuel Jenkins, commanding destroyer USS Bagley, later described the experience as fighting ghosts. His ship was maneuvering to assist the damaged cruisers when he observed torpedo explosions all around the formation, but could not identify the source of the attacks. Japanese ships were presumably somewhere in the area, but radar contacts were confused by land masses and weather conditions. Visual sightings were impossible in the pre-dawn darkness. Jenkins found himself ordering evasive maneuvers based on the locations of explosions rather than any direct detection of incoming weapons. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Every minute that passed brought the possibility of another invisible torpedo racing toward his ship from an unknown direction. Conventional torpedo defense relied on detecting incoming weapons in time to take evasive action, but the long-lance attacks provided no such opportunity. Ships simply exploded without warning, leaving survivors to wonder if they would be next. Meanwhile, Admiral Mikawa's force was demonstrating the tactical flexibility that the long-lance torpedo provided to Japanese commanders. Having launched their initial torpedo spread from maximum range, the Japanese ships had turned to close the distance for a second attack, using both torpedoes and naval gunfire. Their first salvo had been fired from positions that made retaliation impossible. Now they would press closer to finish off damaged targets while remaining outside the effective range of Allied defensive fire. The long-lance weapons fired in the second phase of the attack proved even more devastating than the first. Japanese destroyers Tenryu and Yubari, approaching from the northwest, launched 16 torpedoes at the burning Allied cruisers from a range of 6 miles. At this distance, the torpedoes reached their targets in less than 8 minutes, still providing insufficient warning for effective evasive action, but ensuring maximum accuracy against large, slow-moving targets. USS Quincy became the next victim of this methodical destruction. 2 long-lance torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser simultaneously, one forward and one aft. The forward hit destroyed her number 1 and number 2 turrets, killing over 60 men and starting fires that quickly spread to ammunition storage areas. The aft hit flooded her engine rooms and destroyed her propulsion systems, leaving her dead in the water. Captain Samuel Moore ordered abandon ship within 20 minutes of the initial torpedo impacts, recognizing that his vessel was beyond saving. The speed with which modern warships could be reduced to burning wrecks amazed even experienced naval officers. USS Vincennes, hit by 2 long-lance torpedoes and concentrated naval gunfire from Japanese cruisers, sank in less than an hour. Her captain, Frederick Reefcoal, went down with his ship after ensuring that all possible survivors had been evacuated. USS Astoria lasted slightly longer, remaining afloat for several hours before finally succumbing to progressive flooding and uncontrolled fires. USS Quincy sank at 02:35 hours, taking 237 men with her. The most shocking aspect of the disaster was how completely it had caught Allied forces unprepared. These were experienced ships with well-trained crews, equipped with the most advanced radar and fire control systems available in 1942. They had been positioned to intercept any Japanese surface attack, with overlapping fields of fire and carefully coordinated defensive plans. Yet they had been systematically destroyed by an enemy using weapons that rendered all their preparations useless. Captain Howard Bode, whose USS Chicago survived the initial torpedo attack despite severe bow damage, later testified that the Allied force had been defeated by superior technology rather than superior tactics. The Japanese had not outmaneuvered or outfought the Allied ships in any conventional sense. They had simply used a weapon that made conventional naval defense impossible. The long-lance torpedo had changed the fundamental rules of surface warfare, but Allied commanders had not been informed of the rule changes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The aftermath of Savo Island forced Allied naval strategists to completely reconsider their approach to Pacific operations. Intelligence agencies launched crash programs to understand Japanese torpedo capabilities, interviewing survivors and analyzing wreckage recovered from the battle site. What they discovered shocked even the most pessimistic analysts. The Japanese had developed a weapon system that was years ahead of anything in Allied arsenals, with performance characteristics that seemed almost impossible given known technology limitations. Technical analysis of torpedo fragments revealed the oxygen propulsion system for the first time. Allied engineers had considered pure oxygen propulsion during their own torpedo development programs, but had rejected the concept as too dangerous for practical use. The explosive risks associated with high-pressure oxygen systems seemed to outweigh any potential performance benefits. Japanese engineers had solved these safety problems through years of painstaking development work, accepting significant casualties during testing to achieve their breakthrough. The range and speed capabilities of the Long Lance forced Allied fleets to adopt entirely new tactical formations and operational procedures. Ships could no longer approach suspected Japanese positions with confidence that they would detect incoming torpedo attacks in time to respond. Screening formations had to be expanded to account for weapons that could be launched from distances of 15 to 20 miles. Night operations became extremely hazardous, since the invisibility of long-lance torpedoes was most pronounced in darkness. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Savo Island demonstrated that technological superiority could overcome numerical advantages in naval warfare. Admiral Mikawa's force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer had defeated an Allied formation that included 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. The Japanese ships had suffered minimal damage while sinking 4 Allied cruisers and damaging several others. This level of tactical success was unprecedented in modern naval history, achievable only through the employment of weapons that provided overwhelming advantages to their users. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate participants in the battle. News of the disaster spread rapidly through Allied naval forces, creating a climate of caution and uncertainty that affected operations throughout the Pacific. Commanders who had previously been aggressive in their tactics became hesitant to engage Japanese surface forces, especially during night operations when long-lance torpedoes were most effective. This defensive mindset would persist for months, allowing Japanese forces to maintain the initiative in several important campaign areas. Allied shipyards and weapons development facilities launched emergency programs to develop countermeasures and equivalent weapons. American torpedo designers began crash development of oxygen-fueled systems, but the complexity of the technology meant that effective weapons would not be available for years. British scientists investigated radar systems that might be capable of detecting incoming torpedoes, but the small size and high speed of the weapons made them extremely difficult targets for early radar technology. The most immediate response involved changes to fleet formations and operational procedures. Allied ships began maintaining much greater distances from suspected Japanese positions, operating on the assumption that enemy torpedoes might be launched from ranges up to 25 miles. Night surface actions were avoided whenever possible, with Allied commanders preferring to engage Japanese forces during daylight hours when visual detection was more effective. But these defensive measures came at a significant cost in operational flexibility. Ships operating at extended ranges took longer to reach their objectives and consumed more fuel during transit. Avoiding night operations meant that many tactical opportunities were lost, allowing Japanese forces to move and resupply without interference. The long-lance torpedo had effectively expanded the area of control around every Japanese surface ship, forcing Allied forces to maintain respectful distances that limited their own tactical options. The weapon's impact on Allied morale was equally significant. Sailors who had expected to fight a conventional naval war found themselves facing an enemy whose weapons seemed almost supernatural in their capabilities. Stories of ships exploding without warning spread throughout the fleet, creating an atmosphere of dread that affected combat effectiveness. Even experienced officers began to question their understanding of naval warfare fundamentals. Japanese forces, meanwhile, gained tremendous confidence from their technological advantage. Destroyer and cruiser commanders who had expected to face superior Allied numbers now found themselves capable of engaging much larger enemy formations with reasonable chances of success. The long-lance torpedo had leveled the playing field in surface actions, allowing Japanese tactical skill and superior night fighting techniques to overcome Allied material advantages. The strategic implications were equally profound. Control of critical sea areas could now be maintained by relatively small Japanese forces equipped with long-lance torpedoes. Allied amphibious operations became much more vulnerable to surface attack, since transport ships and their escorts could be engaged from distances that made effective defense extremely difficult. Supply lines across the Pacific faced new threats from Japanese surface raiders, armed with invisible weapons. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations, later described the long-lance torpedo as the most significant technological surprise of the Pacific War. Its impact on Allied strategy was comparable to the introduction of radar or aircraft carriers, forcing fundamental changes in how naval operations were planned and executed. The weapon had transformed Japanese destroyers and cruisers from supporting units into primary strike platforms capable of deciding major naval engagements. The development of effective countermeasures would take years and cost thousands of lives. Until Allied forces could deploy equivalent weapons or develop reliable detection systems, they would be forced to fight at a severe disadvantage in surface actions. The long-lance torpedo had given Japanese naval forces a window of technological superiority that they would exploit ruthlessly in battles across the Pacific. The invisible death that had streaked through the waters off Savo Island represented more than just advanced engineering. It embodied a different philosophy of naval warfare, one that prioritized stealth and standoff capability over traditional concepts of armor and firepower. For the next 2 years, Allied sailors would pay the price for their intelligence agency's failure to understand this revolutionary weapon system. The Long-Lance torpedo had announced its existence in the most dramatic way possible by sinking 4 Allied cruisers in a single night. But Savo Island was only the beginning. The weapon that had taken 15 years to develop would dominate Pacific naval operations until Allied technology could finally catch up with Japanese innovation. The lessons of Savo Island would be written in blood across the Pacific for the next 2 years. October 13, 1942. Cape Esperance, Solomon Islands. Rear Admiral Norman Scott led a task force of cruisers and destroyers into what he believed would be a straightforward night engagement against Japanese reinforcement convoys. Scott had studied the disaster at Savo Island, implementing new radar procedures and communication protocols designed to prevent surprise attacks. His ships maintained extended formations, with destroyers positioned to provide early warning of torpedo launches from conventional ranges. But Admiral Aritomo Goto's Japanese force was not using conventional weapons. At 23:46 hours, Japanese destroyers launched 28 Long-Lance torpedoes from a distance of 13 miles, far beyond Scott's defensive perimeter. The American admiral's carefully planned formations proved useless against weapons that could reach his ships from positions he considered safe. USS Duncan took 2 torpedo hits and broke in half, sinking in less than 10 minutes. USS Boise suffered massive flooding from a single Long-Lance that penetrated her forward magazines, igniting ammunition that killed over 100 men in the resulting explosion. The pattern established at Savo Island repeated itself with mechanical precision. Allied commanders, despite their knowledge of Japanese torpedo capabilities, continued to underestimate the practical implications of 20-mile range weapons. Tactical doctrines developed for fighting enemies armed with conventional torpedoes proved inadequate against the Long-Lance. Ship formations that provided mutual support against normal threats became death traps when invisible weapons could be launched from beyond the horizon. Captain Robert Tobin, commanding USS Boise, during the Cape Esperance action, later described the helplessness of fighting an enemy whose weapons outranged your ability to detect them. His ship's radar could track surface targets at distances up to 15 miles under ideal conditions, but atmospheric interference and sea clutter often reduced effective range to 8 or 10 miles. The Long-Lance torpedo could be launched from distances that placed Japanese ships beyond reliable radar detection, making defense purely reactive rather than preventive. The psychological toll on Allied crews continued to mount with each engagement. Sailors developed what medical officers termed torpedo neurosis, a condition characterized by excessive vigilance, insomnia, and panic reactions to routine shipboard noises. Men standing watch reported seeing torpedo wakes that did not exist, while others became paralyzed by the constant fear of invisible death racing toward them through the water. The mere knowledge that Long-Lance torpedoes could be approaching from any direction at any time created stress levels that affected combat effectiveness throughout the fleet. November 13, 1942. The Third Battle of Savo Island demonstrated the Long-Lance torpedo's continued dominance over Allied defensive measures. Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force, including the battleships USS South Dakota and USS Washington, was positioned to intercept a Japanese bombardment force heading for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Callahan had arranged his ships in a single column formation, believing that concentrated firepower and superior radar would allow him to defeat any Japanese surface attack. Admiral Hiroaki Abe's Japanese force launched their torpedo attack from 16 miles away, sending 67 Long-Lance weapons racing toward the Allied formation at high speed. The first torpedoes reached their targets 8 minutes after launch, striking the light cruiser USS Atlanta with devastating effect. 3 Long-Lance hits broke the cruiser's back, flooding 5 compartments and killing Admiral Scott, who had survived Cape Esperance only to die in this follow-up engagement. USS Juneau, another light cruiser in Callahan's formation, took a single long-lance hit that detonated her forward magazines. The explosion was so violent that the ship simply vanished, vaporized in a fireball that was visible for 50 miles. 587 men died instantly, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, whose loss would become symbolic of American naval sacrifice in the Pacific War. The destruction was so complete that no rescue operations were mounted, as observers initially believed the ship had been hit by enemy bombs rather than torpedo attack. The battleship USS South Dakota, despite her massive armor and advanced damage control systems, suffered significant damage from 2 long-lance hits that flooded several compartments and knocked out electrical power throughout the ship. Captain Thomas Gatch found himself commanding a blinded giant, unable to use his main battery fire control systems or radar equipment. South Dakota's 16-inch guns, capable of destroying any Japanese cruiser at ranges up to 20 miles, became useless when the ship's targeting systems failed. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the November engagement was the performance of USS Washington, the only Allied ship to emerge relatively undamaged from the torpedo attack. Captain Glenn Davis had positioned his battleship at the rear of the formation, where long-lance torpedoes launched at the leading ships had exhausted their fuel supplies before reaching his position. This placement was accidental rather than planned, but it demonstrated that proper spacing and formation discipline could provide some protection against even the most advanced Japanese weapons. The lesson was not lost on Allied tactical analysts. By early 1943, new fleet formations began incorporating much greater distances between ships, with screening units positioned up to 30 miles ahead of main battle groups. These extended formations reduced the concentration of defensive firepower, but provided the time and space needed to detect and evade long-lance attacks before they could reach critical targets like aircraft carriers and battleships. Allied efforts to develop countermeasures intensified throughout 1943, driven by the continued losses to long-lance attacks. The Bureau of Ordnance launched Project Cutlass, a crash program to develop American oxygen-fueled torpedoes. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, worked around the clock to solve the technical problems that had delayed American development of similar weapons. Early test models exploded on launching racks, just as Japanese prototypes had done 15 years earlier. But American engineers gradually learned to handle pure oxygen safely. The Mark 48 torpedo, America's first operational oxygen-fueled weapon, entered limited production in late 1943. But the new torpedo suffered from reliability problems that made it unsuitable for frontline use. Oxygen leaks caused premature explosions during handling and storage. Guidance systems failed under combat conditions. Most critically, the Mark 48's range and speed fell far short of long-lance performance, managing only 12 miles at maximum speed compared to the Japanese weapon's 22-mile capability. British developments paralleled American efforts, with equally disappointing results. The Royal Navy's experimental Mark 25 torpedo achieved slightly better range than the American design, but suffered from accuracy problems that made it ineffective against maneuvering targets. More importantly, British torpedo production facilities lacked the capacity to manufacture oxygen-fueled weapons in significant quantities, limiting the Mark 25 to small-scale testing rather than operational deployment. The technical challenges of matching long-lance performance proved far more difficult than Allied engineers had anticipated. Japanese developers had spent 15 years perfecting their oxygen handling techniques, accepting significant casualties during testing to achieve their breakthrough. Allied programs, operating under wartime pressure with compressed development schedules, could not replicate that methodical approach to problem-solving. Safety requirements that might have been relaxed during peacetime development became critical when torpedoes were being manufactured and deployed in combat zones. Meanwhile, Japanese forces continued to exploit their technological advantage with devastating effectiveness. The Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943 saw 6 American destroyers engage 4 Japanese destroyers in what should have been a favorable engagement for Allied forces. But the Japanese ships launched 32 long-lance torpedoes from extreme range, sinking USS Chevalier and USS Strong before the American formation could close to effective gun range. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes, with Japanese ships escaping undamaged, while American forces suffered over 300 casualties. The pattern of Japanese success continued through the autumn of 1943, with long-lance torpedoes playing decisive roles in engagements across the Central and Southwest Pacific. At the Battle of Cape Street, George, in November, Japanese destroyers used their torpedo advantage to sink 2 Allied cruisers while sustaining only minor damage themselves. The tactical formula remained unchanged: launch long-lance weapons from maximum range, then withdraw before Allied forces could close to effective retaliation distance. But the tide of technological advantage was beginning to shift, driven not by improved Allied torpedoes but by revolutionary advances in radar and fire control systems. The introduction of the Mark 8 fire control radar in late 1943 gave Allied ships the ability to detect and track surface targets at ranges up to 25 miles under favorable conditions. More importantly, the new radar could maintain tracking locks on maneuvering targets, allowing accurate gunfire at extended ranges. The first demonstration of this new capability came during the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943. Rear Admiral Stanton Merrill's task force detected Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori's Japanese cruisers at a range of 18 miles, well before the enemy ships could launch effective long-lance attacks. American destroyers immediately began high-speed maneuvering to close the range, while cruisers opened fire with radar-directed salvos that straddled Japanese ships on the third salvo. Admiral Omori found himself in an unprecedented tactical situation. His ships were under accurate fire from distances that made long-lance attacks impossible, while his own guns lacked the range to respond effectively. The Japanese formation was forced to turn away without launching torpedoes, abandoning their mission rather than accepting destruction under Allied radar-directed gunfire. For the first time since the war began, Japanese surface forces had been outranged and outgunned by technologically superior Allied weapons. The implications of this reversal were profound. Long-lance torpedoes remained devastating weapons against ships that could be approached within launching range. But Allied radar advances were making such approaches increasingly difficult. Japanese commanders who had grown accustomed to engaging enemy formations from positions of technological superiority now faced the prospect of fighting at severe disadvantages against radar-equipped opponents. The changing tactical balance became apparent during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japanese surface forces, attempting to attack Allied carrier groups with long-lance torpedoes, found themselves detected and engaged at ranges of 20 to 25 miles. American battleships and cruisers used their radar advantages to maintain accurate fire while staying beyond effective torpedo range. The result was a complete reversal of earlier engagement patterns, with Japanese ships suffering heavy losses while failing to close to torpedo launching distance. By late 1944, the long-lance torpedo had effectively been neutralized as a strategic weapon, not because Allied forces had developed equivalent torpedoes, but because radar technology had evolved to the point where Japanese ships could be detected and engaged before they could use their torpedo advantages. The weapon that had dominated Pacific naval operations for over 2 years was finally countered by defensive systems that made its superior range and stealth characteristics irrelevant. The final major employment of long-lance torpedoes came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, attempted to use torpedo attacks to break through Allied escort carrier groups in Samar Strait. But American destroyers and destroyer escorts, equipped with modern radar and fire control systems, were able to detect and engage the Japanese ships at extended ranges, while maintaining high-speed evasive maneuvers that made torpedo targeting extremely difficult. USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, demonstrated the new tactical reality by engaging the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano at a range of 14 miles. Using radar fire control, Johnston scored multiple hits with 5-inch gunfire, while successfully evading 4 separate long-lance salvos launched at her position. The destroyer's ability to outmaneuver torpedo attacks while maintaining accurate return fire represented a complete reversal of the tactical situation that had prevailed earlier in the war. The long-lance torpedo's dominance had finally ended, not because the weapon had become less effective, but because Allied defensive capabilities had evolved to neutralize its advantages. Radar technology, combined with improved tactical doctrines and better crew training, had created an environment where Japanese ships could no longer approach close enough to use their superior torpedoes effectively. The legacy of the long-lance torpedo extends far beyond its tactical employment during World War II. The weapon represented a technological quantum leap that forced Allied naval forces to completely reconsider their approach to surface warfare. Its influence can be seen in every modern torpedo design, from the emphasis on extended range and high speed to the development of weightless propulsion systems that leave no trace of their passage through the water. Perhaps more importantly, the long lance demonstrated the decisive importance of technological superiority in modern naval warfare. For over 2 years, a single advanced weapon system allowed numerically inferior Japanese forces to achieve tactical dominance over much larger Allied fleets. The lesson was not lost on post-war naval planners, who recognized that future conflicts would be decided by technological advantages rather than traditional concepts of tonnage and firepower. The oxygen propulsion system, pioneered in the Long Lance, became the foundation for virtually every advanced torpedo program developed after 1945. American, British, and Soviet designers all adopted variations of Japanese oxygen handling techniques, gradually solving the safety problems that had initially made such systems impractical. Modern torpedoes like the American Mark 48 and the Soviet Type 65 can trace their technological lineage directly back to the innovations first implemented in the Type 93. The invisible death that had streaked through Pacific waters from 1942 to 1944 left an indelible mark on naval warfare doctrine. The concept of standoff attack capability, demonstrated so effectively by the Long Lance torpedo, became central to all subsequent weapons development programs. Modern cruise missiles, guided torpedoes, and anti-ship missiles all embody the same basic principle: the ability to engage enemy forces from distances that make effective retaliation impossible. For the men who faced Long Lance attacks during those desperate years, the weapon represented something more personal than technological advancement. It was the embodiment of helplessness, the fear of invisible death that could strike without warning from beyond the horizon. Survivors of Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and dozens of other engagements carried those memories for the rest of their lives, remembering nights when ships simply exploded without apparent cause, and friends vanished in fires that burned until dawn. The Japanese engineers who created this revolutionary weapon could not have foreseen its complete impact on naval history. They had set out to build a torpedo that would give their forces an advantage in the decisive battle they believed would determine control of the Pacific. Instead, they created a weapon that changed the fundamental nature of naval warfare itself, establishing principles that continue to influence military technology development to this day. The Long Lance torpedo had given Japanese naval forces 2 years of technological dominance that allowed them to achieve tactical victories against superior numbers and industrial capacity. When that dominance finally ended, it marked not just the defeat of a particular weapon system, but the beginning of a new era in naval warfare, where technological superiority would prove more decisive than courage, training, or tactical skill. The 24-inch diameter, 29-foot-long messenger of invisible death had delivered its final message. But the lessons it taught about the importance of technological advancement in modern warfare continue to resonate through every conflict that followed. The Long Lance torpedo had changed naval history by proving that a single revolutionary weapon could alter the balance of power between entire fleets. In the end, the weapon that had terrorized Allied sailors for over 2 years was defeated not by superior courage or better tactics, but by superior technology. The cycle that began with Japanese innovation in oxygen propulsion had come full circle with Allied advances in radar and fire control. The invisible torpedo that had sunk cruisers at 11 miles had finally met its match in electronic systems that could see beyond the horizon. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.